Welcome to your next great novel. I'm your host, Phil Williams, and today I have thriller author Jim Heskett on the show. Jim's a multiple award winning author of approximately 35 books. He was born in the wilds of Oklahoma, raised by a pack of wolves with a station wagon and a membership card to the local public swimming pool. Today, you can find him huddled over a laptop at an undisclosed location in Colorado, dreaming up ways to kill his beloved characters. Welcome to your next great novel, Jim.
Thanks for having me, Phil. Have I really written 35 books? Is
I
that true?
I think I counted them. I may have miscounted, but there was a lot of them. I was shocked because I've looked at your book profile from way back when you started with Five Star Thrillers, and there was a lot less books than there are now, and that was only, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago.
Huh. Wow. I'm surprised. I had no idea.
Yeah, there's a ton. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? How you became an author?
Well, first of all, I have to tell you in that bio where it says that the raised by wolves with the membership card to the local public swimming pool. After I published that bio, my dad wrote me to tell me that it was actually a private swimming
Oh,
club that I belonged to, and I said, yeah, I think public swimming pool has a better ring to it. So I'm not 100% honest in my bio there,
oh.
actually.
Well, the
But
secret's out now.
yeah. So you look at this 2 minutes into the interview, Phil, and you've already got it out of me.
Right.
You got my deep dark secret. Well, so I'm an author. I live in a suburb of Denver, Colorado, and I've been here for most of the last 15 years. Before that, I was from Oklahoma. That's where I was born and raised. But I live here outside of Denver with my wife and a small child and a sighing pit bull who's asleep on the couch behind me. So you might hear him interject here and there. But I am an author of mostly thrillers and mystery thrillers, and I've dabbled a little bit. I've got some dystopian and post-apoc stuff, and I've co-wrote one horror book, and I have a couple of short story collections that are mostly comedy. So I've dipped my toes in lots and lots of different things since I started publishing.
Do you find it difficult at writing in a lot of different genres with your audience following you along, or do your audience members tend to follow your work regardless of what you're writing?
Yes, I do find it difficult. And if I had to do it all over again, I probably would not have dipped my toes in those other genres as much. I mean, my audience, primarily the people who follow me on my email list and on social media, are interested in my thrillers. And so when I put out something else, they're not nearly as interested in it. But that was one of the mistakes I made early in my career was dabbling and trying different things when it probably would have been better just to focus on giving the people what they want, you know?
Right. I do think it makes, at least for me, I write in a lot of different genres. I think it makes me a better writer, even though it doesn't make me a more popular, better selling writer.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe so.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your latest book and book series? I think it's the Micah Reed is the latest one.
Well, Mike Reed's actually on hold a little bit now. The what I've been working on for the last year or so is the Lane Parrish series, which Lane Parrish is actually a spin-off character from the Micah Reed books. Whereas Micah Reed is my longest running series for sure. There are 9 books in that series, and there's going to be 10 all told when it's done. But Micah Reed is about a guy who sort of unwillingly found himself in the employ of a Mexican drug cartel, which sounds pretty hard to believe, but he was basically a guy who was drinking a lot, really unhappy, and just sort of took a job because he had nothing else going on, and he didn't really know who he was working for until he got deeper and deeper and deeper. Then some events happened, and he had the opportunity to become a federal witness against the people in the cartel, and then enters witness protection. And so that's where the series starts, is after he's entered witness protection, and it's sort of about him looking over his shoulder. But along the way, in one of the books, he meets a guy named Lane Parrish, and that's the hero of my most current series. Lane Parrish is basically a retired spy who worked for a government organization that was so small it didn't have a name, sort of in the cracks between other government organizations. But now he's retired and just wants to raise his daughter and have tea parties with his 4-year-old daughter, but he keeps finding reasons to have to go back and do things regarding his old life.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you have an excerpt? FYI for the audience, ahead of time I asked for excerpts from the latest book, and so hopefully Jim's got a good excerpt for us.
Yeah, so we talked about this before, and the excerpt I'm going to read is from a book called Snakebite, which is Lane Parrish book number 4 that came out in March of 2019. Let me give you a little bio about, or a little teaser about what Snakebite is about. Lane Parrish is a retired spy who learns his best friend Harry has been kidnapped. Lane travels to Arizona to find out the bad guy demands a secret government document as ransom. The problem is the document was destroyed many years ago. And so this, I feel like I'm on a talk show setting up a clip, but this excerpt is 1,300 words. So it would take me about 6-7 minutes to read it. I read pretty fast. But basically, in the process of hunting for his friend, Lane he's in Arizona and he's looking for his friend, and he finds himself at the bottom of this canyon because he was following some guys chasing a clue, and so he's at the bottom of a canyon. And here we go. I'll just go ahead and read it. Lane stood at the bottom of the canyon shaft, staring ahead at a gauntlet of rattlesnakes. The slot canyon in front of him was about 10 feet wide, and the walls were sheer, too sheer to climb up and over the snakes. He considered climbing back up the shaft he'd dropped down, but that wasn't much of an option either. This part at the bottom was too wide for him to chimney his way up, and he couldn't spot hand and footholds to use, like a laundry chute. Either way, to find the 6 armed men with their suitcase, he would have to push forward, through the snakes, and to whatever came after that. He counted 10 snakes over a span of 30 feet. Some of them coiled and sleeping, some of them with heads raised and rattles shaking to make that ominous sound. Many of them with their beady eyes locked onto the human intruder standing just beyond their reach. There were open areas of dirt and rocks between the snakes, and Lane would have to plan his sprint to land his feet in exactly those spots. One bad step landing near enough to enable one of those things to attack, and today might turn out to be the one he'd regret. Okay, here we go. He put one foot on the canyon wall behind him and pushed off for momentum. His first footfall landed directly in the middle of 2 snakes. One of them snapped, long neck shooting toward his leg, mouth open, fangs out. In jeans and tennis shoes, Lane didn't have much to protect him from that bite. But he pressed off with that foot, and the snake's strike missed his leg by an inch. His next footfall landed directly in front of another snake. This one reared up, preparing to bite. Lane swept his other leg forward and kicked the snake in its head, sending it flying into another snake. The 2 tangled, rolling a few feet away. Controlled breathing, eyes forward and down, Lane pushed his legs with all the power he had. Step, step, jump, step. In 5 more paces, he reached the last 2 snakes. When his foot landed in the soft sand and sank, one lashed out and bit him in the back of the heel. Like a lightning slash, he hadn't had time to move his leg out of the way. He didn't feel fangs sinking into his flesh, so the bite had not been deep enough. Probably. Maybe he just hadn't felt it yet. Instinctively, Lane kicked that foot out, whipping the snake's body forward. It smacked against the side of the slot cannon, like cracking a whip. The viper released its grip, and Lane jumped forward one more step to freedom. Panting, lightheaded, he lifted his foot to check the bite. 2 holes on one side of the heel of his shoe. He took off the shoe and couldn't see any holes in the socks. Nothing had made it into his actual foot. Lane looked back at the line of snakes. Many of them were already coiling again, returning to their dormant state. The one he'd kicked against the canyon wall was dead, motionless in the dirt. It wasn't personal, Lane said. Technically, you threw the first punch. And it goes on from there, but that's probably long enough.
Yeah, that's really good. Do you have a particular personal fear of snakes, or?
No, I'd be more terrified of spiders, but I don't think I could write a scene where Lane has to battle his way through hundreds of spiders. It'd probably keep me up at night. But no, that scene basically came from. So the book is set in Arizona and largely around Sedona, Arizona. And last year, my wife and I went to Sedona just to do some sightseeing and hiking for her birthday. And we got to go up to around Page, Arizona, I think is where it was. There's a canyon there's this canyon touring company, but it's private land, and so there's a canyon that very few people have ever been into, and so it's kind of expensive. But we got to go down in this canyon with private guides, and I think it was called Cardiac X Canyon. There's only a few hundred people have ever been in there, and we got to go down there. And our guide was telling us that I asked him, do you have problems with snakes down here? And he said, I came down here with a journalist one time, and we turned around a corner, and there were a dozen rattlesnakes between us and where we needed to go. And the journalist said, what do we do? And I said, just run and don't look back. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So that was basically the inspiration for this scene. 'Cause I try to keep as much real life in my books as possible, to make them, one, more interesting for me, and two, more believable.
Wow. So run. I would think that walking carefully and slowly would be better, but I guess if they're coiled, they'll strike and you got no chance, basically.
I don't know. They both lived, so I guess they made the right.
Right.
I'm not here to give anybody advice about what to do if they encounter a rattlesnake, but it worked for that guy.
So if any of the listeners try the running method, it doesn't work, they can't call you
Yeah, don't
with their
blame me.
complaints.
Do not consider this podcast as legal advice about what to do with potential snake bites.
That's yeah, absolutely. We've already gone through your bio, which is very impressive. I mean, you multiple awards, 35 books. What would you say on the reverse of that would be your biggest failure as an author?
I think my biggest failure was probably how I started my career. Like we mentioned before about, I dipped my toes in too many different things. In the beginning, I kind of wrote whatever I felt like, and didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to genre conventions. In my first couple of books that I finished, I never published. Particularly in my first book, I spent about 2 years writing that first book and just endlessly revising it and thinking that, with one more draft, and it will then become the work of genius that I know it can be. Of course, it's never like that. And that book rightfully just ended up in the digital drawer, and nobody will ever see it because it's not publishable quality. But I wish I hadn't spent so long writing that, and I would have just spent a few months on it and then moved on to the next thing.
So did anybody read it besides you?
Yes, actually, I did a nonfiction podcast a couple years ago where I picked it apart piece by piece, and read it a chapter at a time on the podcast, and then critiqued and talked about all the things I did wrong with it.
Wow, that's
Um,
brave.
and yeah, that's what some other people said that at the time, and it's actually no longer available. I took that podcast down because I might actually publish a nonfiction book. I might actually publish that book as nonfiction. Like publish a chapter with then my notes, about why I think it didn't work. So I took the podcast down because I'm saving that to maybe possibly use as a nonfiction teaching tool someday.
What do you think was the biggest problem? Was it you not following the conventions, or was there something else that was a major issue?
Well, there were lots of problems with that book. One was that it was kind of a kitchen sink book, in that it had too many characters, and every time, when you're writing a book, you're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if this thing happened? And so anytime I had a thought like that, I would insert that thing in there. So the book was just overstuffed with subplots and with characters and with stuff that didn't go anywhere and stuff that contradicted other stuff. And I wasn't as familiar with the right thriller tropes. All those markers that make a thriller book a thriller.
Right.
I didn't really know how to insert those, so it was just kind of rambling. And yeah, it just wasn't a satisfying piece of fiction.
Right. One of the things I've had a tough time understanding is what I think is interesting does not always translate into what the reader's going to think is interesting.
Yeah, I think that's where that phrase "kill your darlings" comes from. That
Exactly.
sometimes something you have to get rid of something if it doesn't work, even if it's very special to you.
Absolutely. So today, Amazon, I think I saw a statistic the other day that said there were 6.5 plus million books on Amazon, basically. And I think there's another 70,000 that goes up every month, something like that. It's amazing how much content there is. How would you say that you're different from the millions of books and authors that are on Amazon these days?
Well, I'd like to be able to tell you that I'm the only Jim Heskett on Amazon, but that's not true. There's a there's a Harvard law professor named James L. Heskett who publishes nonfiction books, but he's old and is probably going to die soon. So I'll get
Well, well, I'm not even the most popular Phil Williams. If you type in Phil Williams, I'm pretty sure I still come up second, which is
well.
sad.
Seriously though, I think if you look on my website, my tagline on my website is "Thrillers with Smarts." And what I strive to do, and I don't know if this makes me unique, it probably doesn't, but I don't know if it even makes me special, but what I try to do is to write books that are thrilling, that are filled with suspense and make you want to turn the pages as fast as possible, but are also filled with smart characters that you can relate to and you can care about. And even if it's an ex-assassin, government ex-spy who knows how to snap somebody's neck with one hand, you can still see a lot of humanity in that person. That's my goal, is to write books that people find exciting, but also have a very large human element to it.
Yeah, it sounds great. Do you do a tremendous amount of research when you're putting together a new book?
No, I don't. I abhor research.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I really try to write things that are very close to what I know.
Gotcha.
That's one reason why I've had an idea for a detective series in my head for a couple years, but I've been really reluctant to start writing it because I don't want to get a whole lot of the details wrong, and I don't want to spend months and months researching, to be honest.
Right.
Also, I've had this. I'm from Tulsa, and in the early 20th century, there were race riots in Tulsa, and I read a book about these race riots once, and I thought it was fascinating and horrifying. And I've always wanted to write a book that takes place during those race riots. And I've had that idea for several years, but it would be a very heavy research book, and I just don't have the time in my schedule to set aside, 3 or 4 months just to read about it so that I can then write that book. It's much easier to write about sort of everyday people who are thrust into incredible situations, and to try to just focus on the humanity of it, and less on like what kind of ballistics would make this particular gun, the shell from this particular gun, land a particular way on the floor in a crime scene.
Right. What would you say is the most controversial book you've ever written?
Well, I don't really write about stuff that includes a lot of things that would make people angry. I don't really write about politics or anything like that. But probably the book that had the most mixed reaction that I've written was the first book in my whistleblower trilogy, which is actually 4 books, but that would make sense why there's 4 books in a trilogy if you read it. But the first book I published was a novella called Wounded Animals, and it ends on a cliffhanger, kind of. And a lot of people do not take kindly to cliffhangers.
Right.
And at the time, I don't even really consider that it's a cliffhanger, because there's an overall story in the trilogy that's not resolved until the last book.
Right.
And there's a story in the first book that is resolved, but enough people were mad about me not resolving everything in that first book that I got some reviews that said that whatever, that's not people can say whatever they want about the book, but that was probably the only thing close to controversy where people were upset that it didn't round off and tie up everything in a neat little bow at the end of the first book.
Right. Sometimes I think that cliffhangers sometimes have to be viewed not by what people say necessarily, or more so what people do. So they say
Hmm.
they hate it, but then they buy them, but then they buy
Yeah.
them like, hotcakes.
Yeah, basically, yeah, what I've seen from that book is that if people liked the book, they were going to go on to read the next one,
Right.
regardless of their feelings about cliffhangers. And if they didn't like the book, then they weren't going to buy the next one. So it didn't have as much to do with not being resolved. It just mattered whether or not they enjoyed the story and wanted to read more about that particular hero.
Right. I mean, it's not that much different than an episodic television series, or even movies are like that. They'll end on a cliffhanger and you have to see the sequel or to get the
Yeah,
hook.
and also I think that tastes have kind of changed, because I recently rewatched all of the series of Lost.
Yes.
I recently rewatched all 6 seasons, and even then, it was 2004 to 2010. It's like Taste at that time. A lot of people were willing to wait 6 years to find out the answer to that show.
Right.
And I don't think in 2019 that audiences can take that anymore. I don't think someone would be willing to watch 100 episodes of a show just to find out the question, the central question of the whole show.
Right.
You know, I don't think that people have that kind of tolerance and patience anymore that
There's
they
a,
did
yeah,
15 short years ago, you know?
right, and there's a lot more competition for their attention.
Yeah.
So, like most authors, I'm assuming you do quite a bit of reading. What would you say? What type of genres do you read? Authors, that type of thing.
I read all kinds of stuff. I read very widely. Of course, I love thrillers. Um, I love spy novels. Right now, I'm reading Moonraker by Ian Fleming, and it's my first actual James Bond novel that I've read, and it's quite entertaining. I'm just a little bit into it, but he's got this kind of flair with his writing, this way of describing scenes with a great detail that is I find really interesting. I like more classic thrillers like John Grisham. I like a lot of Lee Child. I also read tons of fantasy, but if I do fantasy or sci-fi, which tend to be longer books, I usually do those in audiobook because um, generally my reading is done at night before bed, and so I'm reading 15, 20 pages a day.
Right.
And so I'm not going to sit down and open up an 800-page novel
Right.
when I've got 10 minutes on my Kindle every night. But I do the longer stuff, an audiobook, and I do sci-fi, fantasy, horror. I basically do most genres. I don't really get into romance. But yeah, I read really widely, which may have something to do with why I've dabbled in so many different genres because I'm such an omnivorous consumer of fiction that maybe it kind of made me feel like I could try all kinds of different things.
Right.
But yeah, so I read
So,
all kinds of stuff.
so are you primarily reading traditionally published books, or do you occasionally read some indies in there too?
Sometimes I don't even know. I've read some books that I didn't know or care until after who wrote them. I do read some books by friends,
Right.
and sometimes I just find whatever a book that's mentioned on a podcast or something, or I'm an Amazon Prime member, so they give me a free book every month, and so I read a lot of those, whatever sounds interesting. So I probably read more of those Amazon Prime books than anything else. So I'm probably mostly actually reading Amazon imprints. It's probably where I get most of my books from.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't think there's the discrepancy between trad published and indie published. I don't think that gap is near as wide as it was, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, it used to be very easy to tell if a book was indie published just based on the cover.
Right.
But as a whole, indie covers have gotten better, and there are probably still plenty of people putting out books with homemade covers, but you never see those anymore. Would you say 70,000 new books a month? That's 2,000.
Right.
That's over 2,000 books a day being published, and the ones that don't look pro are quickly going to sink to the bottom.
Absolutely. Yeah. The majority of them, I think the stat was that from 50,000 sales rank and up, that's like 83% of the income in sales. So basically,
Hmm.
from 50,001 all the way to 7 million is 13% of the income.
Hmm.
So it's definitely a very hierarchical business for sure. Probably it gets even worse when you get to the tippy tops of the mountain where the top 0.01% are pulling in a huge chunk of the pie,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have to start some sort of social movement, socialism for authors. I'm adamantly opposed to socialism, by the way.
Okay.
Disclaimer. So, so what book would you recommend to the audience and why?
If you're looking for a good thriller, probably my favorite in the thriller genre is The Firm by John Grisham. I didn't actually read that until just a couple of years ago, maybe even a year ago, and it's a classic. It's an old book. I don't even think they have cell phones in that book. I think it's
No, I
like
don't
from
think they did.
yeah, it's late 80s or early 90s.
Yep.
But I think he just did a great job of nailing everything to make a book a hit, and that, right away in the first chapter he makes you care about the character, and gives him an interesting goal and puts obstacles in his way. It's about this hotshot law school grad who gets recruited by this. He's a hotshot. He could go to work for some big New York firm, but he gets recruited by this small outfit, basically with an offer that's too good to refuse. And so he goes to work and notices strange things going on at the law firm right away. And then pretty soon he's caught up in something where there's a lot of danger, and he's worried about his family. And it's really a page turner. It's really very interesting. And the audiobook version is read by Scott Brick, who is an amazing narrator, who is somebody who I wish he would narrate my life. I'd like to have him just walk along behind me and narrate everything that's happening in my life.
Yeah, I like Grisham. I do hear people, and I think this happens when authors get very popular, is people love to bash them when they're huge. So you hear a lot of people saying they don't like Grisham, but I actually do like his work. I enjoyed The Partner. I think that was my favorite one, and I liked The Rainmaker a lot. And The Firm I also enjoyed. The only one I didn't enjoy that I read was The Chamber, just because of the
Hmm.
ending. So for you guys, people out there that have read that, you know why. But yeah, I agree. I think Grisham is definitely good.
Yeah, I know he said some things in an interview a couple years ago that were probably not too smart to say, and I know that he lost some fans because of that. But I like the book
That's interesting.
regardless of his
What did he
personal
say?
stuff. Um, I don't remember exactly, but he said something about statutory rape. I think he was a little tipsy when he was being interviewed and said some stuff that he probably shouldn't have said. About white people going to prison. I don't remember. I don't remember all the
Wow.
details, and I don't really want to get it wrong. But
Right.
it was not a very intelligent thing to say on his part, and he could have probably the kind of thing that as soon as he hung up the phone, he said, "Oh crap, I should have, I should have really thought about that before I gave those answers." But
Especially these days, you can't.
yeah,
I mean, you have to be. You don't have to be careful about what you say, but it can definitely get you into trouble. I mean, we are living in the era of social justice for sure, and if you're saying the wrong things, all of a sudden, I don't know if you did you ever hear about that woman who she was at Arlington National Cemetery, and she posed for a picture, and and the sign said quiet and respect, and she cupped her hand over her mouth, acted like she was screaming, and she was giving the camera the double middle finger. And then anyway, so she posts this on Facebook, and of course the whole thing blew up in her face. And basically the internet essentially did the internet version of tar and feathering, and ruined her life. She lost her job. I mean, she was a pariah for many years. I don't know what happened to her, but that's happened to this public shaming that goes on the internet for people doing or saying the wrong things is not uncommon.
Hmm. No, I hadn't heard that particular story. Some people should be publicly shamed, but I don't know. That's probably a whole other discussion, not
Yeah,
relevant to
yeah.
books.
Shaming is really interesting because it can. I've read a book on the topic. My wife's really interested in Brene Brown, who's a shame researcher. So I know a lot about it through her, and then also from reading some of those books. But it can be just absolutely devastating to people that go through it. I mean, it's essentially almost, the next worst thing would be actually dying. I mean, it's really really awful for people. Anyway, but yeah, we could go down a huge tangent with that. And I actually did I think that's an episode 2 of this podcast where my wife and I, we actually analyzed the book on a John Ronson book called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed." So that's a really interesting nonfiction book that's worth checking out, I think.
Hmm.
So anyway, so thank you so much for coming on the show, Jim. Really appreciate it. Where can people find out about you and your books?
So if people are looking for my nonfiction stuff, that's at thejugglingauthor.com, where there's a podcast and a blog, and I have a nonfiction book. If you're interested in my thriller fiction, you can find it at jimheskett.com. It's JimHeskett.com. where I
Great.
apparently have 35 books that I didn't know I had that
Yeah,
many.
absolutely. You're quite the prolific author. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I think you had very similar amounts to me numbers wise when I first looked at your page. I have 14 by the way. And
Hmm.
so when I first looked at your page, we had roughly similar amounts. So that just shows you how much more books you've written. I got to get my ass in gear.
Mm.
So anyway, but thank you so much for listening to another episode of Your Next Great Novel. Be sure to subscribe. You can find the podcast at philwbooks.com and on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn.